Sometimes a team's record at the end of the season can be misleading. They might finish 4-12 or 5-11, but they had a lot of close games. They were very competitive. They just lost games that maybe they should have found ways to win. Then on the flip side, you could have teams that win 10 or 11 games, and you're like, oh, they had a nice winning record, but they beat a lot of bum teams, and they weren't nearly as good as maybe that record indicates. Well, then there are certain times where I think the record perfectly reflects what the state of the organization and team is. And when I look at the Miami Dolphins and their 8-8 record in 2014, I think that perfectly crystallizes what this team and organization is. They're not bad. They're not great. They're middle of the road. They're mediocre. They've got a mediocre general manager, in my opinion, in Dennis Hickey. They've got a mediocre at best head coach in Joe Philbin, a mediocre front office, a mediocre ownership, a mediocre middle of the road offense, a mediocre middle of the road defense. I mean, that's a perfect way to sum up the Dolphins. They're mediocre. They're just kind of middle of the road. So that's why I don't understand if you're trying to get beyond middle of the road, if you're trying to perhaps contend with the New England Patriots in the AFC East, or at least, if nothing else, try to become a playoff team in 2015 and beyond, and you want to really build that team up around your young quarterback, Ryan Tannehill, why in the bluest of blue fucks you would bring in a failed GM from a mess of a situation that was the New York Jets in former Jets GM Mike Tannenbaum to bring him in to oversee your football operations. Please help me understand how this makes any fucking sense. You see what the Jets were in 2014. They were a disaster. And while Idzik, the general manager, got fired, a lot of the damage was still in place from the Tannenbaum regime. This guy was in over his head. This guy didn't know what the fuck he was doing when it came to the draft, and most certainly didn't understand the draft. So now the Dolphins, doing what mediocre organizations do, they reward that mediocrity by not just bringing in this once failed general manager from the New York Jets who worked for a little time as a sports agent. They're bringing him in and they're giving him a much higher position than he fucking deserves. That's the type of crap that a mediocre organization does. And even when you look at this team throughout the 2014 season, you see that mediocrity that I'm talking about. I mean, this is a team that beat the Patriots to start off the season. This is a team that dominated and shut out the Chargers in the middle of the season. But far too often they didn't show up against good teams, teams with winning records. They went 3-7 against teams with winning records. That's something that mediocre teams do. The sign of a really good team is typically, unless you're the Steelers, you typically go out there and you beat most, if not all, of the bad teams, and you beat some of the good ones. Well, in the Dolphins' case, they beat several bad teams, and they only beat a couple of good ones and not nearly enough good ones to be able to sit there and get themselves over the hump and become a playoff team. And once again, just as they did in 2013, they found a way late in the season to choke a potential playoff berth down their fucking legs. You know, again, middle of the road on offense, middle of the road on defense. If you have one thing that you kind of point to, and if you're a Dolphins fan and say that better times may be ahead outside of the 8-8 record, is the fact that Ryan Tannehill definitely took some steps forward in year number 3 and definitely progressed and showed some real-time franchise quarterback potential that I don't think enough people are really talking about. He threw for over 4,000 yards. Imagine that. You improve the offensive line in front of him. You give him a better running game. And look how the progress happens. He was over 66% in terms of completion percentage. He had 27 touchdown passes to only 12 interceptions. He was the team's second leading rusher. I mean, Tannehill was underrated, I think, for how good he was in 2014, especially once that light switch went on and it seemed like it was after the Raiders game or in that week leading up to it, there was talk of benching Tannehill and they were going to go with Matt Moore because the Dolphins would do that because that's what mediocre organizations do. They didn't do that, and Tannehill really responded, and I thought he put together a really solid season. And now you're heading into his 4th year in the league. You're getting ready to start thinking about whether or not you're going to extend his contract and really make him that franchise piece long term. You know, seeing what you saw out of him in 2014 has to leave you some hope that things are going to get better for the future. If you're going to be 8-8, but you've got a potential franchise quarterback, you do have to feel good about where your future direction may be going. In terms of the offseason, I do think the Dolphins did some things to help themselves in the offseason, but not nearly enough. They brought in Brandon Albert in free agency, and he was playing well before he got hurt. They drafted Juwan James, who was still, in my mind, a big reach coming out of Tennessee in the first round, but he was pretty solid at tackle, both on the right side and then when he flipped over to the left side. Second round pick Jarvis Landry was what I anticipated him being coming out of LSU, a really quality number 2 NFL caliber wide receiver. They brought in some nice pieces on that offense to help out Ryan Tannehill. They definitely significantly, markedly improved that offensive line, and that play was a lot better in 2014. Consequently, as a result, combine that with the improved running game, get an improved performance out of Ryan Tannehill. I look at this defense, though, and again, it was middle of the road. They had 5 games where they allowed 30-plus points, but then you have a game where they shut out the San Diego Chargers. You have a game where they impose their will on the New England Patriots in the second half in the opening week of the season, and they just give them all types of fits. This is a defense with a player like Cameron Wake, who is one of the more underrated players on the defensive side of the ball in all of the National Football League. But frankly, along with Olivier Vernon on the other side of him at end, not a whole lot else on the defensive side of the ball. Not a whole lot else, especially in the back 7 of that defense. Just again, kind of a middle of the road unit. Good but not great against the pass, good but not great against the run, good but not great at getting pressure on opposing quarterbacks. They are a reflection of what this team is. So heading into this offseason, now that you've continued to keep Joe Philbin, the head coach, and Dennis Hickey, the general manager, you have a valuable commodity here for the Dolphins. You at least have continuity, and I'm glad to see it, even though I'm not convinced that Hickey or Philbin or any other thing other than mediocre in their current roles. At least there is a continuity there, and you're giving it another year to see where you go with it, and that's a good thing. But they need to get some things right in this offseason. When I look at their needs, I think first and foremost, they have to find another big-time wide receiver because they really don't have one. And especially with the crap that Mike Wallace pulled in Week 17, I don't know how you can bring him back into that locker room and save any face at all. You have got to bring in a big-time outside number 1 type of wide receiver so that we can keep Jarvis Landry in that number 2 receiver role, or even sometimes maybe line him up in the slot. Ryan Tannehill is your franchise player. He's that guy you have to build around. And in order to build around him, you have to give him more help and you have to give him more pieces. And I think the Dolphins do need some help still at wide receiver. Defensive side of the ball, I think they need help at linebacker. I think they've been criminally negligent in terms of addressing that linebacking position properly in recent years, and their linebacking core, frankly, stinks. They need an impact player in that linebacking core. Some of you may point to Deion Jordan perhaps being that guy. If he could stay away from the drugs and stay on the field, perhaps he could be, but he might not be. They could still use another impact player, though, in that linebacking core. On offense, I think they could also use a running back. Lamar Miller's a nice player, but I don't know if he's a big-time, truly number 1 featured type of running back. Again, what's wrong with having 2 quality running backs? That's something they really don't have. It's something that I think they really need because, as I mentioned, I believe Ryan Tannehill was the second leading rusher on that team. When your quarterback is your second leading rusher, that's not always a good thing. On defense, I think they could use some more help at the safety position. They brought in Luis Delmas for a reason, and that's not necessarily a good thing. They could use some help up front at defensive tackle, too. They could use more depth. They could potentially be losing Odrick in the offseason. He played really well. They need some depth. This is a team that could, with a good offseason, position themselves for a playoff run in 2015. But with a bad offseason, and that's very possible if Mike Tannenbaum is overseeing the operation, this is a Dolphins team that could be in a big state of flux, that could only win 5 or 6 games in 2015. They could affect Ryan Tannehill's long-term growth and success at the NFL level, and they could be starting all over again come 2016.